I'm not here to become Mrs. Moretti, sir. I only want to cook.
Emma's words silenced the marble hall. Days earlier, she had been standing at her brother Daniel's sink, flour still clinging to her apron, when he placed a newspaper beside her. "The Moretti estate needs a head cook," he said. 3 meals a day for Gabriel Moretti, his daughter, and 30 guards. Emma looked away. Her bakery was gone, her savings nearly empty, and the thought of entering the home of New York's most feared Mafia boss made her stomach tighten. Daniel pushed the advertisement closer. "You don't need their pity. You need one chance to show them what you can do." Emma stared at the printed address, never imagining that one simple meal would soon bring laughter back to a grieving child and change her own life forever. Winter pressed hard against New York, turning the narrow streets of Queens silver with frozen rain, while wind rattled the loose window frame of the apartment where Emma Brooks had been sleeping on a worn sofa for nearly 2 months. The apartment belonged to her older brother, Daniel Brooks, a tall, narrow-shouldered man of 35 with thinning brown hair, a tired face, and the habit of rubbing the bridge of his nose whenever money was mentioned. Daniel was not cruel by nature, but years of working double shifts as a delivery dispatcher had made him impatient with problems he could not solve, and Emma's bankruptcy had become one more weight he carried into every exhausted evening. 3 months earlier, Emma had owned a small neighborhood bakery with yellow walls, 6 wooden tables, and a front window that always smelled of butter and cinnamon before sunrise. She had trusted her closest friend with the accounts, only to discover that the woman had emptied the business account, disappeared, and left Emma responsible for unpaid suppliers, back taxes, and a lease she could no longer afford. Since then, Emma had taken whatever temporary kitchen work she could find, but nothing lasted more than a few days, and each rejection seemed to come with the same polite smile and the same hidden judgment. At 30, she was soft-faced and noticeably plus-size, with warm brown skin, thick dark hair, usually tied into a low bun, and gentle hazel eyes that revealed every emotion she tried to hide. She had spent years learning how people looked at her before they looked at her work, yet that knowledge had never made the humiliation easier. That morning, Daniel placed a folded newspaper advertisement beside her cup of weak coffee and told her the rent was 7 weeks overdue. He tried to sound practical, but his voice carried the roughness of someone frightened of losing the only home he had left. The advertisement announced that the Moretti estate in Manhattan was seeking a head cook capable of preparing daily meals for a private family and more than 30 security employees. The salary was higher than anything Emma had earned, even when her bakery was doing well, and housing could be arranged for the right candidate. Emma stared at the name Moretti and felt her stomach tighten, because everyone in New York had heard of Gabriel Moretti. Publicly, he was the chairman of Moretti Group, a vast corporation with interests in ports, hotels, logistics, finance, and real estate. Privately, people lowered their voices when they spoke of him, as though the walls themselves might report disrespect. "They're looking for trained chefs," Emma said quietly, tracing the edge of the advertisement with her thumb. Daniel leaned against the counter and reminded her that being afraid had not paid the rent, then told her, more sharply than he intended, that she could not stay on his sofa forever. The words hurt, but Emma knew they were true, and by 8 o'clock she had put on her cleanest navy dress, covered it with a plain gray coat, gathered her recipes into an old leather folder, and boarded the train toward Manhattan. The Moretti estate stood behind iron gates on a wooded stretch north of the city, its pale stone walls rising above the snow like a private fortress. Armed guards in black winter coats checked every applicant before allowing them through, and by the time Emma entered the main courtyard, nearly 20 candidates were already waiting beneath heated canopies. Most wore embroidered chef jackets, expensive shoes, and expressions sharpened by confidence. One was a tall French-trained chef named Laurent Voss, a silver-haired man with narrow lips and the rigid posture of someone accustomed to being praised. Another was Rebecca Sloan, a stylish hotel pastry chef in her early 40s, with straight blonde hair, cool blue eyes, and a voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard the names of the luxury restaurants where she had worked. Emma had barely joined the line when Rebecca looked at her plain folder and then at her body before whispering that the estate must also be interviewing kitchen porters. Laurent laughed under his breath and asked whether Emma had misunderstood the advertisement. A young server nearby covered a smile with her hand, while another candidate muttered that feeding 30 guards did not mean the chef was supposed to look as though she had sampled every meal first. Emma felt heat rise into her face despite the cold, but she forced herself to remain still. She had learned long ago that defending herself too quickly often entertained cruel people more than Simons did. So she looked toward the mansion and reminded herself that she had not come for their approval. She had come because she knew how to turn simple ingredients into food people remembered. The candidates were taken inside one by one, and most emerged 20 minutes later, looking offended or unsettled. When Emma's name was finally called, an elderly man named Arthur Bell escorted her through a corridor lined with dark paintings and polished wood. Arthur was the Moretti family's chief steward, a thin man in his late 60s, with white hair, a perfectly trimmed moustache, and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades keeping other people's secrets. He studied Emma's worn shoes and inexpensive coat without mockery, though his expression suggested he doubted she would last long. The interview took place in an enormous professional kitchen, where Gabriel Moretti stood alone beside a marble work table. He was 41, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit with no tie, and his dark hair was brushed back from a severe, angular face. A short black beard sharpened his jaw, while a faint scar near his left temple gave him the appearance of a man who had survived violence without ever discussing it. His grey eyes were calm rather than openly hostile, but they carried the weight of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. 4 years earlier, his wife had died, and those close to him said grief had stripped away what little patience he once possessed. He did not smile when Emma entered, did not offer his hand, and did not ask where she had trained. Instead, he pointed to a small arrangement of flour, butter, eggs, onions, potatoes, carrots, and a few herbs. "Show me why you deserve the position," he said. For one painful second, Emma wondered whether this was another joke arranged for the amusement of wealthy people, but Gabriel's expression contained no ridicule. She removed her coat, washed her hands, tied on an apron, and began without opening her recipe folder. She mixed flour with yeast, warm water, salt, and a small amount of butter, kneading the dough with steady palms until it became smooth beneath her fingers. At the same time, she chopped onions, carrots, and potatoes for a simple soup, allowing the vegetables to soften slowly rather than drowning them in spices. Arthur watched from the doorway as Emma moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, cleaning each tool after using it and wasting almost nothing. Gabriel remained near the work table, studying her more closely than the food. Emma felt his attention, but she refused to hurry, because fear had ruined enough things in her life already. When the bread came from the oven, its crust was deep gold, and its center soft enough to release steam when she tore it open. She placed a thick slice beside a bowl of soup and told Gabriel that the meal was simple because good food did not need to pretend to be more expensive than it was. Gabriel tasted the soup first, then the bread, and for the first time, his expression shifted. It was not quite pleasure, but something quieter and more personal, as though the flavor had reminded him of a place he had forgotten. Arthur stepped forward and began to ask whether Gabriel wanted to review Emma's references, but Gabriel set down the spoon and looked directly at her. "You begin tomorrow morning," he said. Emma stared at him, uncertain whether she had heard correctly, while Arthur's eyebrows lifted in open surprise. The previous candidates had brought certificates from Paris, Rome, and the finest hotels in New York. Yet Gabriel had dismissed most of them within minutes. Emma had brought nothing except an old folder, a borrowed coat, and hands still marked by small burns from years of baking. Arthur cautiously reminded him that there were more applicants waiting outside, but Gabriel did not turn away from Emma. A person who knows how to cook with heart does not need another certificate, he said. The words struck Emma with such force that she had to lower her eyes before either man saw how close she was to crying. For months, she had been treated as foolish for trusting the wrong person, weak for losing her bakery, and unworthy because of the space her body occupied. Gabriel Moretti had judged her in less than an hour, but he had judged the one thing she had feared no one would ever notice again: her work. When Arthur handed her the employment papers and explained that she had been appointed head cook of the Moretti estate, Emma signed her name with trembling fingers. She left the mansion beneath a sky still heavy with snow, carrying no promises beyond the job she had earned, unaware that the kitchen, waiting behind those iron gates, would soon change far more than her own life. Emma Brooks woke every morning long before sunrise, when the Moretti estate still rested beneath a blanket of winter silence, and the kitchen windows reflected nothing but darkness beyond the falling snow. By 5 o'clock, the enormous kitchen had already become her world. She moved through it with calm confidence, tying her dark hair into a neat bun before lighting the ovens one by one, measuring flour by instinct rather than scales, and checking every refrigerator shelf before deciding the day's menu. During her first week, she realized that the previous kitchen staff had relied almost entirely on expensive pre-packaged desserts, frozen bread, and oversized portions that left trays of untouched food thrown away every evening. Emma had spent years running a struggling bakery where every handful of flour mattered, and she could never ignore unnecessary waste. She quietly rewrote the weekly menu without asking for praise, replacing costly imported pastries with fresh bread baked before dawn, preparing soups from vegetable trimmings but would otherwise have been discarded, and planning each meal so leftovers from lunch naturally became ingredients for dinner rather than garbage. Nobody had instructed her to save money, yet within days the kitchen budget began shrinking, while the quality of every meal improved. And although no one said it aloud, the staff started realizing that the new head cook possessed something far more valuable than impressive certificates. The Moretti estate never truly slept. More than 30 security guards worked rotating shifts around the clock, protecting one of the most influential men in New York, and every meal had previously been little more than fuel swallowed between assignments. Emma slowly changed that routine, without making speeches or demanding appreciation. Instead of leaving identical trays waiting beneath warming lamps, she learned each team's preferences. The older guards, who worked overnight patrols, received rich beef stew with homemade bread that stayed warm through the freezing mornings. The younger men, assigned to outdoor security, found fresh sandwiches, roasted chicken, and fruit packed neatly before changing shifts. Those returning from exhausting overnight surveillance often discovered cinnamon rolls cooling on wooden racks beside hot coffee waiting before anyone asked. Among them was Marcus Doyle, a broad-shouldered former Marine in his early 40s, whose shaved head, thick beard, and permanently stern expression made him appear intimidating even while saying thank you. Years protecting politicians and businessmen had taught Marcus never to trust strangers easily. Yet, after tasting Emma's cooking for only a few days, he became the first guard to quietly tell the others they should arrive at meals before everything disappeared. Soon, conversations during lunch lasted longer than before. Laughter became common inside the security dining room, and men who normally ate in silence began arguing over who deserved the last slice of freshly baked bread. Without realizing it, Emma had transformed eating from another duty into the happiest part of their working day. The greatest change, however, arrived from someone far smaller. Sophie Moretti, Gabriel's 6-year-old daughter, had inherited her late mother's dark curls and her father's striking grey eyes, though those beautiful eyes had carried unusual sadness for someone so young. Since losing her mother 4 years earlier, Sophie had become painfully quiet, speaking only when necessary, and spending most afternoons reading alone beside the library window, or drawing pictures no one else was allowed to see. The household staff adored her, yet every attempt to cheer her usually ended with polite smiles instead of genuine happiness. On Emma's 4th morning, while fresh bread filled the kitchen with its warm aroma, Sophie cautiously stepped through the doorway, wearing a pale blue sweater several sizes too large, and clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, whose ears had been repaired countless times. She did not introduce herself immediately. Instead, she stood silently, watching Emma knead dough with careful, fascinated eyes. Emma noticed the little girl almost instantly, but pretended not to, understanding that frightened children often needed space before trusting strangers. Only after several quiet minutes did she smile gently and ask whether someone wanted to help make breakfast. Sophie hesitated before climbing onto a small wooden stool beside the preparation table. Emma carefully washed the child's tiny hands before placing a small ball of dough in front of her and demonstrating how gentle pressure from both palms could slowly transform something sticky and shapeless into smooth bread ready for baking. Sophie copied every movement with intense concentration, occasionally glancing toward Emma for reassurance whenever the dough stuck to her fingers. Each successful attempt earned quiet encouragement instead of exaggerated praise, and before long, the little girl surprised herself by giggling after accidentally covering the tip of her nose with flour. It was a small sound, almost uncertain at first, but Emma noticed how quickly it disappeared whenever Sophie realized someone might hear it. Rather than mentioning it, Emma simply dusted a little flour across her own cheek and pretended complete innocence, until Sophie laughed again, this time louder than before. That morning ended with uneven little bread rolls and misshapen cookies that could never have been sold inside any bakery. Yet Emma carefully baked every single one, because she knew perfection mattered far less than confidence. Sophie proudly carried her creations upstairs, returning the next afternoon before anyone invited her. Days gradually settled into a comforting rhythm. Every afternoon after her lessons, Sophie hurried toward the kitchen instead of hiding inside her bedroom. Emma introduced simple recipes one step at a time, allowing the little girl to crack eggs, measure sugar, stir chocolate batter, and cut cookies into stars, hearts, and tiny snowflakes. Whenever mistakes happened, Emma never corrected them with disappointment. She simply smiled and said that every baker collected failures before discovering favorite recipes, quietly remembering how many burned loaves she herself had hidden from customers during the first year of owning Brooks Bakery. Those memories no longer filled her only with regret. Watching Sophie's confidence grow somehow transformed old pain into useful wisdom, and Emma began realizing that perhaps losing her bakery had not taken away everything she loved about baking. Sometimes the child asked shy questions about bread, sometimes about cakes, and occasionally about Emma herself. Emma answered honestly, without burdening Sophie with adult sorrow, speaking instead about how baking always reminded her that patience could turn ordinary ingredients into something capable of making people smile. Sophie listened carefully, storing away every word with the seriousness children often reserve for people they truly admire. Throughout those weeks, Gabriel remained consumed by endless meetings, contract negotiations, and security briefings that often kept him away from the estate until after sunset. His conversations with Emma rarely extended beyond polite greetings or practical questions about household meals, yet he could not ignore subtle changes unfolding around him. Security reports arrived on time because guards returned from breaks more quickly. Kitchen expenses decreased despite noticeably better food. Even Arthur Bell, whose standards bordered on impossible after decades serving wealthy families, admitted that the mansion somehow felt warmer than before. Gabriel noticed laughter drifting through hallways where silence had long become ordinary, though he rarely had time to discover its source. Part of him suspected the improvement would prove temporary, like every other attempt to restore normal life after his wife's death. Experience had taught him not to hope too easily, because hope had become painfully expensive. One snowy evening, Gabriel returned home earlier than expected after a business meeting ended ahead of schedule. Removing his overcoat, he paused in the hallway upon hearing unfamiliar laughter echoing from the kitchen. It was bright, carefree, and unmistakably Sophie's. For a heartbeat, he wondered whether another family had somehow entered his home, because he had not heard his daughter laugh with such abandon in years. Drawn forward, almost without thinking, Gabriel quietly approached the open doorway. Inside, Sophie sat comfortably on Emma's lap, while both of them decorated freshly baked cookies with colorful icing. The child's cheeks glowed with happiness as she proudly held up a crooked snowman cookie, laughing so hard that icing smeared across her sleeve. Emma laughed with her instead of correcting the mistake, gently helping Sophie add tiny chocolate eyes, before applauding as though the cookie belonged in the finest bakery in New York. Gabriel stopped walking. He simply stood there in complete silence, unable to remember the last time his daughter had looked so completely free from grief. Arthur appeared quietly beside him, careful not to interrupt the scene unfolding inside the kitchen. The elderly steward lowered his voice almost to a whisper, his usually composed face softened by genuine emotion. "Miss Sophie hasn't laughed like that since her mother passed away," he said gently. Gabriel remained silent for several long moments, his eyes never leaving his daughter. The walls he had spent 4 years building around his own heart suddenly felt far less certain than before. Finally, he looked toward Emma, who still had not noticed he was standing there, and answered with simple sincerity, "Thank you." The warmth that Emma Brooks had quietly built inside the Moretti estate did not remain hidden for long. By the middle of December, stories about the mysterious new head cook had spread far beyond the mansion's stone walls, passing from drivers to suppliers, from catering companies to hotel managers, and eventually into the circles of wealthy families who followed every rumor surrounding Gabriel Moretti. Some people praised the remarkable improvements in the estate's kitchen, while others spoke with suspicion instead of admiration. In their minds, it seemed impossible that the most guarded man in New York would suddenly trust a woman he had known only a few weeks, unless there were motives beyond cooking. Emma, however, remained completely unaware of how quickly strangers had begun inventing a version of her life that had nothing to do with reality. She continued waking before dawn, preparing fresh bread for the household and carefully teaching Sophie new recipes every afternoon, believing that sincere work would always speak louder than gossip. She had underestimated how easily envy could disguise itself as certainty. The newest security recruits had not witnessed the difficult months before Emma arrived, nor had they seen Sophie hiding silently inside empty hallways, or the dining room filled with untouched meals. To them, they saw only the present. Gabriel occasionally entering the kitchen without announcing himself, Arthur treating Emma with unusual respect, and little Sophie following the cook wherever she went like a shadow. Among the new guards was Kevin Rhodes, a 28-year-old former nightclub bouncer with broad shoulders, closely cropped blonde hair, and a square jaw that often wore an arrogant smile. Kevin had impressive physical strength, but little discipline, having spent years solving disagreements with insults before fists. Unlike Marcus Doyle and the older guards, who valued loyalty above pride, Kevin enjoyed becoming the loudest voice in every room. During lunch breaks, he entertained younger recruits with careless jokes, believing confidence and cruelty were nearly the same thing. The rumors surrounding Emma quickly became his favorite source of amusement, and each passing day his comments grew less subtle and more insulting. One afternoon, while Emma supervised the preparation of dinner, several guards gathered near the kitchen entrance, waiting for fresh bread to leave the oven. Kevin leaned casually against the doorway, watching Emma knead dough, while Sophie sat nearby, decorating gingerbread cookies. Smirking toward the others, he spoke loudly enough for everyone inside the kitchen to hear. "No wonder the boss promoted her so quickly," he said with a laugh. Some people know exactly how to win a powerful man's attention. Guess cooking isn't the only talent she's bringing to the mansion. A few uncomfortable chuckles followed, but nobody answered. Emma froze for only a second. The words themselves hurt. Yet what struck her even harder was seeing Sophie slowly lower the cookie she had been decorating, confusion replacing the happiness that had become so familiar over recent weeks. Emma carefully wiped the flour from her hands, walked directly toward Kevin without raising her voice, and looked into his eyes. For a brief moment, he mistook her silence for weakness. The sharp sound of her hand striking his face echoed through the kitchen before anyone had time to react. Kevin stumbled backward in complete disbelief, his cheek instantly turning red, while every conversation inside the room disappeared into stunned silence. The commotion reached Gabriel within minutes. He entered the kitchen with his usual calm expression, though everyone present recognized the dangerous stillness that settled over him whenever discipline had been broken. Arthur stood quietly beside him, while Marcus Doyle and several senior guards had already positioned themselves between Kevin and the rest of the staff to prevent the argument from growing worse. Gabriel first looked toward Emma, whose breathing remained uneven but whose expression showed no regret. Then he turned toward Kevin and simply asked what had happened. Believing he could still justify himself, Kevin shrugged and insisted he had only been joking. He claimed Emma had overreacted and argued that people throughout the city were already saying the same things. Gabriel listened without interrupting. When Kevin finally stopped speaking, Gabriel's voice remained remarkably soft, making the silence around him feel even heavier. "Collect your belongings," he said. "Your employment with Moretti Security ends today." Kevin stared in disbelief, convinced such a punishment could not possibly follow a few careless words. Gabriel never raised his voice. "A man who cannot respect innocent people cannot be trusted to protect this family. Leave before my patience disappears." Two senior guards immediately escorted Kevin from the kitchen, and no one else dared question the decision. Although justice had been immediate, Emma found no satisfaction in it. That evening she remained alone in the kitchen long after dinner had ended, quietly washing already spotless dishes, simply to keep her hands occupied. She had spent years rebuilding her confidence after every insult about her appearance. But hearing strangers suggest she had earned respect through manipulation rather than hard work renewed wounds she believed had already healed. More painful still was the fear that Sophie might one day hear those same rumors and begin questioning the sincerity of their friendship. As the last lights in the kitchen dimmed, Gabriel entered alone, removing his jacket after another long day of meetings. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Emma finally broke the silence without looking at him. "I came here because I wanted to cook," she said quietly. "Nothing more. I don't want people believing I have another reason for staying. I don't want your daughter hearing those lies and wondering whether I ever cared about her." Her voice remained steady until the final sentence, when disappointment overcame determination. Gabriel stood beside the long wooden preparation table, his gaze resting on the loaf of bread Emma had forgotten to slice. He understood far better than most people how quickly rumors could destroy reputations, because his own name had carried countless false stories for decades. Since becoming head of the Moretti Empire after his father's assassination many years earlier, he had learned that silence often defeated gossip more effectively than arguments. Yet looking at Emma, he realized she had never chosen a life where constant suspicion became normal. She had simply wanted an honest chance to rebuild herself. After what felt like an endless silence, he finally looked directly into her eyes. "As long as you are under my roof," he said, every word measured and absolute, "no one will ever be allowed to insult you." There was no dramatic promise, no attempt to comfort her with empty reassurance. Instead, his voice carried the certainty of a decision already made. Emma nodded slowly, surprised that those few simple words eased more pain than lengthy apologies ever could. Several days later, preparations began for the annual Moretti Group Christmas Gala, an event attended by influential business leaders, investors, politicians, charity organizers, and executives from across New York. The ballroom inside the Moretti Grand Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, while enormous Christmas trees covered in silver ornaments reflected warm, golden light across polished marble floors. Gabriel personally asked Emma to oversee every dish served that evening, insisting the entire menu should reflect her ideas rather than those of expensive consulting chefs. He also surprised her by inviting both her and Sophie to attend the celebration after dinner service. Emma hesitated, knowing exactly how people would look at her once she stepped into a room filled with perfectly dressed socialites. But Sophie clapped excitedly at the invitation and begged Emma not to refuse. Wanting only to avoid disappointing the little girl, Emma quietly agreed. When Emma entered the ballroom wearing a simple emerald green evening dress, conversations noticeably slowed. Wealthy guests glanced toward her with carefully disguised curiosity, while others made little effort to hide their judgment. Some assumed she was another employee who had wandered into the reception by mistake. Others recognized her from recent gossip and exchanged knowing smiles, convinced they were finally seeing the woman rumored to have captured Gabriel Moretti's attention. Emma felt every stare, but instead of lowering her head, she focused on helping the serving staff present the final courses exactly as planned. One dish after another reached the tables: freshly baked rosemary bread, slow-braised beef, delicate winter vegetable soup, roasted salmon with citrus butter, and desserts inspired by the recipes she had once sold inside her little neighborhood bakery. The ballroom gradually changed. Conversations about Emma's appearance disappeared beneath conversations about extraordinary flavors, perfect balance, and remarkable simplicity. Distinguished guests who had spent years dining in Michelin-starred restaurants asked who had created the menu. They expected the answer to be a famous celebrity chef. Instead, they learned that every course had been designed by the plus-size woman many of them had dismissed only an hour earlier. By the end of the evening, several respected entrepreneurs approached Emma personally, introducing themselves with genuine warmth rather than polite obligation. They praised not only the quality of her food, but also the unmistakable sense of comfort every meal had created, explaining that the dinner reminded them of family rather than luxury alone. Two hotel owners asked whether she accepted private catering requests, while another businessman requested permission to discuss future collaborations after the holidays. Emma answered each conversation humbly, still struggling to believe the same people who had barely acknowledged her arrival were now requesting her business card. Across the ballroom, Gabriel watched without interrupting, while Sophie smiled proudly beside him as though she had expected this outcome from the very beginning. For the first time since losing her bakery, Emma realized that people were no longer looking at her body before noticing her work. They were recognizing her for the talent she had fought so hard to preserve. And that quiet recognition became the greatest Christmas gift she had received in many years. The weeks following the Moretti Group Christmas Gala changed Emma Brooks's life in ways she had never imagined while standing behind the small counter of her lost neighborhood bakery. Newspapers covering the charity banquet praised the remarkable menu, without relying on expensive culinary trends or theatrical presentation, describing it instead as food that reminded successful people of forgotten family dinners and childhood kitchens. Food critics who had attended as invited guests began asking who the quiet woman behind the meal had been. And soon, Emma's name appeared in restaurant magazines, culinary blogs, and interviews discussing the return of honest cooking in an industry increasingly obsessed with spectacle. Emma herself avoided every interview request. Each morning she still tied on the same apron before sunrise, checked the pantry, baked fresh bread for the household, and prepared breakfast for Gabriel, Sophie, and the Moretti security team, as though nothing outside the mansion had changed. She had spent too many years discovering how quickly praise could disappear to trust sudden popularity. What mattered to her remained exactly what it had always been, seeing empty plates returned to the kitchen because every meal had been enjoyed. One snowy afternoon, Arthur Bell entered the kitchen carrying an elegant cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax bearing the emblem of the New York Culinary Association. The elderly steward smiled in a way Emma had begun recognizing over recent months, a smile reserved for rare occasions when he genuinely admired someone's achievement rather than merely acknowledging it. Inside the envelope rested a formal invitation requesting Emma's participation in the city's annual charity culinary competition, an event bringing together respected chefs from luxury hotels, famous restaurants, and culinary schools throughout New York. The competition's purpose extended beyond professional recognition, as every winning recipe would later be prepared for homeless shelters, children's hospitals, and community kitchens during the winter season. Arthur explained that invitations were never offered lightly. Most contestants had spent decades building reputations before receiving such recognition. Emma stared at the letter without speaking, convinced the association must have confused her with someone else. She had no television show, no cookbook, and no prestigious culinary education. She was simply a woman who once owned a small bakery that no longer existed. That evening, Emma quietly placed the invitation beside Gabriel's dinner plate, intending only to inform him that she planned to decline. Gabriel finished reading every page before lifting his eyes toward her. Across the table, Sophie leaned forward so eagerly that a strand of dark, curly hair slipped across her forehead. "You're going," the little girl declared, before either adult could speak. Emma smiled sadly and shook her head, explaining that competitions belong to celebrity chefs with famous restaurants, not someone who had only recently rebuilt her confidence after losing everything. She admitted she feared becoming a public embarrassment, especially when cameras and journalists would be watching every mistake. Gabriel remained silent for several moments, turning the invitation over in his hands, as though considering something far beyond the competition itself. Finally, he placed the letter back on the table with calm certainty. "You earned that invitation," he said. "Nobody handed it to you out of sympathy. They invited the cook whose food changed an entire household." Sophie quickly climbed from her chair, wrapped both arms around Emma's shoulders, and whispered with complete confidence, "If your bread made me smile again, it can make everyone smile." Their faith in her felt strangely heavier than any trophy could ever become, because disappointing herself had always been easier than disappointing people who genuinely believed in her. The competition took place inside the restored Grand Metropolitan Exhibition Hall, where dozens of professional kitchens had been constructed beneath high glass ceilings overlooking Central Park covered in fresh snow. Contestants arrived carrying polished knife cases, assistants wearing matching uniforms, and years of prestigious experience displayed proudly across embroidered jackets. Emma arrived alone, carrying only a simple wooden recipe box that had survived the closure of Brooks Bakery. Waiting near the entrance stood Isabella Monroe, an internationally recognized television chef in her early 40s, whose elegant posture, silver blonde hair, and flawless white chef's coat reflected decades of success. Isabella had built her reputation transforming traditional recipes into luxurious fine dining experiences. And while she greeted most contestants politely, her confidence often bordered on quiet superiority. Standing beside her was Victor Hale, a lean 45-year-old executive chef from one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels. His sharply trimmed beard, perfectly styled dark hair, and habit of measuring people with quick, dismissive glances revealed a man who believed excellence belonged only to those carrying prestigious names. Upon recognizing Emma from newspaper photographs, Victor exchanged an amused smile with another contestant and remarked loudly that charity competitions had apparently become more interested in inspirational stories than serious cooking. Someone nearby added that perhaps judges would award extra points for personality instead of technique. Several contestants laughed politely. Emma heard every word. For just a moment, the familiar ache returned, the old instinct telling her to apologize for entering spaces where people believed she did not belong. She remembered standing outside the Moretti estate while strangers judged her body before tasting her bread. She remembered Kevin's cruel words inside the mansion kitchen and the countless customers years earlier who had assumed a plus-size baker lacked discipline before sampling a single pastry. Those memories could easily have become distractions, yet Emma looked down at the worn wooden recipe box resting beneath her hands and felt something entirely different. Inside were handwritten recipes stained with flour and butter, many written in her late mother's careful handwriting, and others developed during endless early mornings inside Brooks' bakery. None of those recipes had ever been created to impress critics. They had been created to comfort tired workers, celebrate birthdays, welcome newborn babies, and remind lonely neighbors that someone cared enough to wake before dawn for them. Emma quietly thanked the volunteers preparing her workstation, tied on her apron, and ignored every voice except the one telling her to cook honestly. Rather than presenting elaborate artistic sculptures or expensive imported ingredients, Emma announced that her menu would honor the little bakery where she had learned that ordinary food could carry extraordinary memories. She prepared slow-roasted vegetable soup enriched with homemade stock, simmered from carefully saved ingredients, baked rustic country bread with a crisp golden crust, served herb butter whipped by hand instead of machine, and created warm apple pastries inspired by the first dessert she had ever sold after opening Brooks' Bakery years earlier. Every movement inside her kitchen remained calm and deliberate. She wasted almost nothing, cleaned as she worked, and treated each ingredient with the same respect she had shown inside the Moretti mansion. Judges wandered between stations expecting dramatic presentations, yet many found themselves lingering beside Emma's table because the aroma reminded them less of competition and more of home. The audience could not fully understand why her dishes felt different until tasting them. There was no unnecessary complexity hiding imperfect technique. Every flavor carried quiet confidence, balance, and sincerity, allowing familiar ingredients to become unforgettable through care rather than extravagance. Hours later, after blind tastings and careful deliberation, the judges returned to the main stage, while contestants gathered before them in nervous silence. Emma stood near the back of the room, convinced simply finishing without embarrassment had already become a personal victory. When the chairman of the New York Culinary Association unfolded the final results, he praised one contestant for proving that genuine hospitality could never be replaced by luxury alone. Then he announced Emma Brooks as the first-place winner. For several heartbeats, she remained perfectly still, unable to connect her own name with the applause erupting throughout the hall. Cameras turned toward her while reporters hurried forward, yet Emma heard almost nothing until a familiar voice rang across the audience. Before anyone could stop her, Sophie broke away from Arthur and raced across the stage with complete disregard for ceremony. The little girl threw her arms around Emma's waist as tightly as she could and laughed through happy tears. "I knew you would win!" she shouted so loudly that her words echoed beneath the enormous glass ceiling. The audience burst into warm applause, many smiling at the heartfelt moment unfolding before them, rather than the formal presentation they had expected. Gabriel watched quietly from the front row, pride visible despite the reserved expression he almost always maintained in public. Around the hall, contestants who had mocked Emma's appearance only hours earlier lowered their eyes in uncomfortable silence. None of them could deny what every judge had just confirmed. Emma Brooks had not won because of sympathy, publicity, or circumstance. She had won because the simplest meal in the competition had carried the greatest heart. And for the first time in many years, the world recognized her not for how she looked, but for the extraordinary gift hidden within her ordinary hands. Snow continued to blanket New York as the city settled into the quiet beauty of late winter. But inside the Moretti estate, warmth had become stronger than the cold outside. Only a few months earlier, the mansion had been known as a place where conversations were brief, meals were silent, and every hallway seemed to carry the weight of a family frozen in grief. Now, the scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the corridors before sunrise. Laughter occasionally echoed from the kitchen, and even the security guards found themselves lingering after dinner instead of rushing back to their posts. The victory at the New York charity culinary competition had become more than Emma Brooks's personal achievement. It had become another reminder to everyone living inside the estate that hope could quietly return without anyone noticing the exact moment it arrived. Arthur Bell often caught himself smiling while reviewing household reports because, for the first time in many years, they contained fewer security concerns and more requests for extra flour, butter, and chocolate chips from a little girl determined to become the mansion's youngest baker. Even Gabriel Moretti, whose schedule remained consumed by international negotiations and the endless responsibilities of leading one of New York's most influential business empires, found himself looking forward to returning home, instead of remaining at the office until midnight. To celebrate Emma's victory, Gabriel instructed the household to organize a private reception inside the mansion, rather than renting one of the luxurious hotels owned by Moretti Group. He wanted the celebration to take place where Emma's journey had truly begun, the kitchen that had slowly transformed into the heart of the home. The great dining hall was decorated with elegant white roses, evergreen branches, and hundreds of warm candles reflecting softly across polished oak walls. Business partners, senior executives, long-serving employees, and members of the household staff gathered together without the rigid social divisions usually present during corporate events. Among the invited guests was Eleanor Grant, the chairwoman of the Moretti Foundation, a graceful woman in her early 60s with silver hair arranged neatly above kind blue eyes that revealed decades spent working with orphanages and children's charities rather than chasing public attention. Eleanor had watched Gabriel mature from an ambitious young executive into a guarded widower after his wife's death, and she privately admitted to Arthur that she had not seen genuine peace on Gabriel's face in many years. Looking around the beautifully prepared room, she quietly realized that the greatest change had not come from expensive renovations or successful business deals. It had come from one woman who believed feeding people well was another way of loving them. Emma stood near the entrance, wearing a simple ivory dress that reflected her personality far better than the extravagant gowns offered by several designers after her competition victory. She had politely declined every luxury brand's attempt to dress her, insisting she wanted to remain herself instead of becoming someone she barely recognized. Although she had grown more confident over recent months, standing before so many distinguished guests still made her heart race. She remembered arriving at the Moretti estate, carrying nothing except an old recipe folder and the fear of another rejection. Now, many of the same influential people who once doubted her were greeting her with sincere admiration, asking about future recipes, bakery ideas, and community projects. Emma accepted every compliment politely, but inside she remained the same woman who still woke before dawn to check bread dough with flour-covered hands. Recognition had changed her circumstances, but it had never changed the reasons she loved cooking. When dinner concluded, Gabriel slowly rose from his seat and walked toward the center of the hall. The conversations faded almost immediately. Throughout his career, every public speech he delivered had focused on business expansion, financial growth, or strategic partnerships. His employees expected another formal address, celebrating Emma's culinary success and the positive publicity it had brought to Moretti Group. Instead, Gabriel rested one hand lightly against the back of his chair and allowed an unusual silence to settle before speaking. His deep voice remained calm, but for those who had worked beside him for years, there was a warmth they had rarely heard before. "When I hired Emma Brooks," he began, "I believed I was looking for someone capable of preparing meals for my family and my security team. I thought I needed a talented cook. I was wrong." His words drew the complete attention of every person inside the room. Gabriel turned toward Emma as though the hundreds of guests around them had quietly disappeared. "She gave us something no employment contract could ever describe," he continued. "She reminded over 30 hard-working men that a meal could feel like home instead of another obligation. She taught an old household that kindness is strongest when it expects nothing in return. Most importantly, she gave my daughter back the laughter I thought grief had taken forever." Sophie looked down shyly for a moment before smiling at Emma with unmistakable affection. Gabriel paused again, collecting thoughts he had spent months refusing to admit even to himself. This mansion was once only a place where people lived. Emma turned it into a home. She also reminded everyone standing here tonight that the value of a human being has never been measured by appearance, wealth, or reputation. It is measured by the good they quietly leave in other people's lives. No one interrupted. Even the most powerful executives remained completely silent because they understood they were no longer listening to the chairman of Moretti Group. They were listening to a father whose life had been rebuilt in ways financial success could never accomplish. Gabriel stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward Emma. She instinctively held her breath, uncertain what he intended to do. Every pair of eyes followed him as he stopped only a single step away from her. His normally reserved expression softened into something rarely witnessed by anyone outside his family. For years, he had buried every vulnerable emotion beneath responsibility, believing strength required constant distance. Emma had never asked him to lower those walls. She had simply shown him, day after day, the trust often returned through ordinary moments shared honestly. Without another word, Gabriel slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A quiet gasp moved through the hall. Arthur removed his glasses to hide the sudden moisture gathering in his eyes, while Eleanor smiled with complete understanding. Gabriel looked up at Emma and spoke clearly enough for everyone present to hear. "Emma Brooks," he said, "would you spend the rest of your life walking beside Sophie and me?" There were no dramatic promises of wealth or influence, no carefully rehearsed declarations designed to impress an audience. The question was simple, because the life they had built together had always been built upon simple things. Emma felt tears filling her eyes before she could stop them. She looked first at Gabriel, then toward Sophie, who stood nearby with hopeful gray eyes shining brighter than any chandelier above them. The little girl smiled through her own tears, clasping both hands tightly together as though afraid to breathe until she heard the answer. Emma remembered every painful moment that had led her here. The empty bakery she had locked for the final time, the overdue rent, the cruel laughter outside the mansion gates, the humiliation she had endured because of her appearance, and the quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult morning afterward. None of those memories disappeared. Instead, they became proof that even broken roads could still lead somewhere beautiful. Unable to speak immediately, Emma simply nodded. Moments later, she whispered, "Yes." Applause erupted throughout the hall as Sophie ran forward and wrapped both arms around them, laughing with the same carefree joy that had first returned inside the kitchen months earlier. 1 year later, Brooks Bakery reopened its doors on a lively Manhattan street with the support of Moretti Group. But its greatest success was never measured by profits or popularity. Every Saturday morning, children from struggling families gathered outside before sunrise because Emma insisted that fresh bread should never become a luxury reserved only for those who could afford it. Gabriel continued leading his business empire with the same discipline that had made him one of New York's most respected and feared leaders. Yet those closest to him noticed he smiled more often than ever before. Sophie grew into a cheerful little girl, whose happiest place remained behind the bakery counter, wearing a flour-covered apron beside the woman she proudly called her mother.
Customers often believed the story of Gabriel and Emma had begun with a proposal, a grand celebration, or a fairy tale promise. The people who truly knew them understood something much simpler. Their love had never begun with a confession beneath elegant lights. It had started quietly inside a kitchen, with humble meals, warm bread fresh from the oven, and a woman whose only dream had been the chance to do the work she loved with all her heart. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or extraordinary signs. Sometimes they come quietly through a warm loaf of bread, a kind word, an open heart, or someone who chooses compassion when the world offers judgment. Emma never chased wealth, power, or recognition. She simply remained faithful to the gifts God had placed in her hands. And in His perfect timing, those ordinary acts of love transformed not only her own life, but an entire family. Perhaps the miracle you've been praying for isn't as far away as you think. Keep doing good, even when no one notices. Keep loving, even when the world misunderstands you. God often opens doors that no human being can close. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment sharing the moment that moved you the most. Your story may become the encouragement someone else needs today. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your family and friends, so that together we can spread more stories of hope, kindness, and faith. May God bless you, protect your family, fill your home with peace, and guide every step you take. Thank you for watching, and may His grace always be with you.